So I'm going to talk about tweaking character settings really quick. And the reason I'm going to do it this way is that I want to go through the process of actually setting up this type properly. But in order to make this a good review video for you to go back to, where you can just see exactly what the tools do, I'm going to do that up front, explain them all, and then I'm going to walk through the process and let you listen in on that. So in order to get to those settings, what we want to do is choose up here in the options bar with the type tool selected, this option to toggle the character panel. And you can see that's going to open it up. And here are where we can find all of the settings that I want to cover in this particular video. We're going to walk through them relatively quick just to explain how they work. And then, like I said, at the end, wrap up how to actually use them well. So the first one I want to talk about is leading. Leading is the space between lines of type. Yours is probably set to auto. So let me do that to get it back to where you are probably at already. And you can see that moved my line a little bit closer to the previous line. This is most like line spacing in a word processor, where you can choose double spaced or triple spaced type. Well, here's the same thing, except it's much more detailed. If I go to a really small number, the text will even overlap. If I choose a really large number, there's more spacing between the lines, and it spreads everything out. And if I choose auto, I let Photoshop do it by default. The next option that I want to talk about is tracking. Tracking is the space between letters. So this option changes vertical spacing. This option changes horizontal spacing. So let's go ahead and crank it up to 100. And you can see how the text gets spread out. There's more space between each letter. If I drop it down to -100, it takes away the space between letters. And the default for this is 0. And last we have kerning. Kerning, as you see, I can't choose all of these options. It's grayed out because kerning affects the spacing between specific letter pairs. So I can change the spacing between this R and the T. You can see now they're closer together, and now they're farther apart. Now, when I first learned about this, I remember thinking, what a useless tool. Why would anyone ever do that? And the bottom line is that this is what separates designers from newbies. Taking the time to properly kern, track, and lead your text is really critical. And you don't know about kerning. You don't even recognize it sometimes looking at good or bad examples until you learn and take the time to do it. So it's really the mark of an expert when it comes to working with type. The last couple options I want to talk about, and I will show you a different way to work because I was earlier changing the settings on the whole layer, but all of these settings can also be changed by highlighting type and making the change, and in that way only the selected letters will be affected. So I'm going to go here and change the vertical scale. And another cool trick, you're going to see that I'm going to demonstrate that you can also scrub these settings by just placing the mouse over this option and then moving the mouse back and forth to adjust them automatically. If I crank that up, you can see that it makes it taller. And if I shrink it down, it makes it really short. But it's actually distorting the text and bending it out of shape. And the default here is 100. I can just type that in. Horizontal scale is the same thing, except sideways. So this is sort of the weight gain, weight loss program of typography. I can see that I can get the text really skinny, or I can stretch it out to be a lot farther. And we're going to look at good uses for this in just a second. This is another one where the first time I saw it, I was like, well, just change the type up to a larger point size, but it conveys a different feeling, and we're going to talk about that next. So those are all the settings that generally you will need. Type and point size are pretty obvious, I think, to everybody. We're familiar with that. So I'm not going to go over that again. But what I want to do now, I'm going to click my check mark, and I'm going to walk through manually setting this up, and I'm going to talk about how I make the design decisions and how to use these properly in order to design type well. So I'm going to continue on with that. If you're just looking for a review, we're done. If you want to explore how to determine what values should go in these boxes, that's what we're doing now. So the first thing I like to do when I'm designing type is zoom in. And normally I zoom in to just 100% and see what size that gets me. And actually, that's actually perfect for this particular design with my current resolution that I'm recording at. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start playing with some of these settings. One of the things that is most obvious to me is I cannot stand the spacing between the text. I think there's way too much room between gasoline and heart. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to manually select the text. That way I can do that trick that I showed you earlier where I can scrub the settings and you can see how fast it responds. And I can get this set exactly the way that I want it. And I'm just dialing it in, and I'm not looking at all at my settings over here. I'm looking visually at how it's affecting my text. And I think that I'm pretty happy with that setting. I think that that looks good. It might be just a little bit close. And sometimes I'll look at the number and I'll say, well, I just want to bump it. Let me try 25. You know, it's not bad. I'm going to go to 23. This is really what design is all about, is getting the feel and trying to understand the way that it's communicating and how it presents itself. It's sort of an acquired taste that only with practice can you really start to pick up on how to make the right choices. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub the tracking a little bit, because right now I feel like the text is a little bit too spread apart. I want to sort of convey this closer feeling. And I'm at -40 right now, and I'm pretty happy with that setting. I'm going to go to -50, which is one of the defaults. You know, actually I like this at -50. But when I do, I note all of a sudden I'm seeing some problems, and this points out the whole issue of kerning. Because look at our text right now. This E and A is basically touching. That's really bothering me, and it makes it seem uneven. This E and A seems way too close, when this H and E seems like there's a ton of space between it. Same here, the R and T seems way too close. And it also seems like there's 3 different distances between the N and the E, the I and the N, and definitely the L and the I feels much different. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click in between these areas, and now I get to play with the kerning. I'm going to drop this down to 50, maybe a little too much. Here I'm going to bump it just a tiny bit. That's not enough. Okay, I like that. And here I'm going to drop this down just a tiny bit. These numbers, by the way, when you choose, 10 and 5, they're very, very small settings, even 25. Okay, that looks good to me. Okay, so right now I like the word gasoline. It looks really good to me. And subtle differences, but that's the difference between a designer and somebody who's just throwing text on a page. So here we're going to just kind of bump a little space here between the E and the A. Let me bump that up a smidge. I think I need a little more. I think that's too much. Okay, so I might need to go with something like somewhere in the middle. Don't like that either. All right, that seems perfect to me. And here I just want to drop this down. I'm going to use a very small value. And I want a little more space here. And I'm picking these numbers just randomly. They happen to be working. And that just comes with time. And you start to see the space between letters. And it's not that I know the value of 25. I just know that it's sort of real little bit, kind of in the middle, and then larger values. So it's really more of a scale of the light, medium, and heavy setting. So right now I'm going to click the check mark to accept those changes. And I'm pretty happy with how this looks. But one thing that I don't like is how this word heart is so much smaller than gasoline, and it just sort of throws things off a little bit. I'm also seeing here that I want less space in here between the H and the E. Okay, that looks good. So what I'm going to do, I could change the size of the type, but I don't think I like that. I don't like the idea of the text being a real different value. So I'm going to put that back to 30, which is where I started. And here is where I can use the horizontal scale. And what I'm going to do is just stretch it. And here's where I definitely want to highlight the text, because you notice how as I make the adjustments, it's doing very, very fine adjustments and showing me live how it looks. And what I'm doing to set this up is I'm just looking at this E and the T. I want that to be perfect right in between those two. So I click the check mark here and I look at it. And then normally I zoom out And I almost perfectly love it. The only thing that I'm seeing is that I feel like this G is a little bit farther to the left, and that this H, I just need to drop this H back a little bit and then make some adjustments. So I'm going to click in front of the H, and here's a really, oops, and I missed it. You can see that I actually made a new text layer. So I just cancel that. There we go. And I can tell that I've selected the right box because I get the lines under my text, so I know that I'm in that text box. But here's a trick that I like to use. I'm going to actually just change the kerning up here of the space between the left edge and my H. And I pulled that back just a little bit, but it just seems a lot better aligned to me. So now I need to also, I see my T and my E are off. So now I'm just going to bump this up, and I'm going to just bump it up by one number here. It seems like it's a little short, so I'm going to do 0.5. Let me try 149. Actually, that looks about perfect to me. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you do it. I'm looking at this text, and to me, it looks really great. Now, sometimes I'll walk away and I'll come back and I'll see something I didn't notice before. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's the process. There's not a process where you become a great artist and then you just say, oh, I need -5 between the H and the E and 15 between the E and the A. It doesn't work that way. You kind of just play with it and stretch it back and forth. I always like to zoom in and then zoom away a little bit and just sort of look at how perfect that is. That E and the T just looks great. And you know what else? This is also moving closer and then moving back out. That's just the fun of being an artist, appreciating the work. This, what we just did, is art. Really good typography is really beautiful art. So that's the process. The last thing I want to do is I want this whole text area to be bigger. So I'm just going to kind of click on it here and do Control T, and I hold Shift to make sure that I don't stretch my text, right? If I don't hold Shift, I can do all this crazy stuff. If I hold Shift, it stays in the same aspect ratio. The other thing is that if I hold Alt or Option on the Mac, it stretches from the middle. And that way it kind of stays centered in my area the way that I want it, and I get it the size that I want. And then I just let go of the mouse, and then I can let go of the keyboard. I click my checkbox, and look at that. I have perfect type. I'm going to sleep better tonight. I'm going to snuggle up to my pillow and say, Rob Schwartz, you're a darn good designer. So give yourself a shot at it. Give it a try. And once you start to see it, you see good typography everywhere, and you see bad typography somewhere. There's a very funny cartoon online where it says, if you really hate someone, teach them about kerning. Because now when you see bad kerning, once you understand it and you see bad kerning on a sign or the side of a building, it'll drive you nuts. So I apologize in advance. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is the art of design.